And this is the video for Malcolm X's after the bombing speech. This is the last civil rights speech that we will discuss. A little bittersweet, I suppose, but let's get to it. His speech was given in his speech was given on February 13th, 1965. Malcolm X will be killed a little while after this. Um, just to keep in context, Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, so 3 years later. As far as the details of how Malcolm X was killed, I think you should do your own research on that. It doesn't. It does, of course, matter, but not too much to me. I'm more concerned with the way he was saying than I was to how someone murdered him. Just keep that in mind. But his house was bombed the day before this, so he's a little shaken when he's giving this speech. Something else you need to know: this is, of course, well after his split from Elijah Muhammad. He's already spent some time overseas. He's already done Hajj, so he's this is the nadir of his career, of course. So this is the last time that he's able to really articulate his thinking and understanding of the civil rights movement, which I think is important. So as always, we're just going to go through the document. This document's not annotated like the other ones were. So just keep that in mind when you're actually reading this. You'll have to do a lot of the reading yourself. But as I go along, um, just notice the key points I'm trying to make here. So he says here, Attorney Milton Henry, distinguished guests, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, friends and enemies. So he does continue saying that. He says here, I want to point out first that I'm very happy to be here this evening, and I'm thankful to the Afro-American Broadcast Company for the invitation to come here this evening. As Attorney Milton Henry has stated, I should say Brother Milton Henry because that's what he is, a brother. I was in a house last night that was bombed, my own. It didn't destroy all my clothes, but you know what fire and smoke do to things. The only thing I could get my hands on before leaving was what I have on now. It is something that made me lose confidence in what I'm doing. My wife understands, and I have children from the size on down, and even in their young age, they understand. I think they would rather have a father or brother or whatever the situation may be who will take a stand in the face of reaction from any narrow-minded people rather than to compromise and later on have to grow up in shame and disgrace. It's interesting what he says here. The narrow-minded people probably or the Nation of Islam trying to get him to shut up, but it probably wasn't that as well. Violence being used as a rhetorical tool against speakers is commonplace. I mean, Dr. Martin Luther King had death threats. African Americans were threatened with lynching if they wanted to vote, and so using violence to get people to stop doing things is not as popular now as it was then, thankfully. But it worked, all right. And for most people, when their houses were bombed and this and that, you got to also understand that cops ain't going to try to investigate who did this. They don't care about Malcolm X. And they don't care, for the most part. Then they don't really care about African Americans in general. And so they're not going to worry if some house gets bombed here or there. They're not too concerned with all that. But Dr. King, I'm sorry, Malcolm X is frazzled. You can kind of tell in the speech. So let's continue. He says, "So I ask you to excuse my appearance. I don't normally come out in front of people without a shirt and tie. I guess that's somewhat a holdover from the Black Muslim movement, which I was in. That's one of the good aspects of that movement. So that's interesting. He has a critique of the Nation of Islam. It teaches you to be very careful and conscious of how you look, which is a positive contribution on their part, but that positive contribution on their part is greatly offset by too many liabilities." Oof, that is some strong language. Very strong language here. And it's interesting how he said that. All right, so he says here, down here, he starts giving a speech. He says here, tonight, one of the things that has to be stressed, which has not only the United States very much worried, but also has France, Great Britain, and most of the powers who formerly were known as colonial powers worried, and that is the African Revolution. They are more concerned with the revolution that has taken place on the African continent than they are with the revolution in Asia and Latin America. And this is because there are so many people of African ancestry within the domestic confines or jurisdictions of these various governments. there is an increasing number of dark-skinned people in England and also in France. So what Malcolm X is trying to do, he's always tried to do this. Malcolm X wanted African Americans in the United States to feel more connected to the continent of Africa. It's called Diaspora. Diaspora. Kind of, I think I mispronounced that, but it's Diaspora. Just pause. I think that's right. Diaspora. Anyway, it's the idea that because of slavery and other colonial powers making decisions for Africans in the African continent, that all Africans that are spread out throughout the world are connected to Africa, and like Africa's needs are the needs of African Americans and other blacks across the world. And like, so for example, I'm African American, and so I have a connection, according to Malcolm X, I have a connection to Africa, and like I should either A, be concerned with Africa, or B, we can study it, right? We can study diaspora and talk about how it works and how different Africans that are spread across the world have adjusted and dealt with it. It's actually really interesting to talk about. African Americans in the United States are a very unique group. I mean, not many people have been taken from their lands in that big a number, brought to South America and North America and made slaves, right? And then hundreds of years later, they were freed, quote unquote. Then you're looking at the 1960s right now with Malcolm X and Dr. King, and what you're seeing is the integration, right? Like, how do you integrate freed slaves into a society, right? And how do you make it so they have equal rights? And it's very tough, right? And so, in Malcolm X's perspective, African Americans should be more connected to Africa, not only for political reasons, but also for just logistical reasons, right? If all Africans all over the world decided they were unified in their efforts, you'd have a lot of power. So if you look here, down here, it says, but the American Negroes or the Afro-Americans who were in these various countries, some working for this government, some working for that government, some in business, they were just socialized and they had turned their back on the cause over here. They were partying, you know. When I went through one country in particular, I heard a lot of their complaints that I didn't make any move. But when I go into another country, I found the Afro-Americans there were making the same complaints. So we sat down and talked, and we organized a branch in this particular country of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. That one was the only one in existence at the time. Then during the summer when I went back to Africa, I was able in each country that I visited to get the Afro-American community together and organize them and make them aware of the responsibilities to those of us who are still here in the lion's den. So it's very interesting, right? He's saying like, hey, just because you left America, just because you are living in Europe or Africa, you still have responsibility to the African Americans in the United States. And the African Americans in the United States do need help, right? They don't have civil rights, they don't have voting rights, and so it's interesting how he's talking about that. And he says here, I might point out here that colonialism or imperialism, as the slave system of the West is called, is not something that is just confined to England or France or the United States. The interests in this country are in cahoots with the interests in France and the interests in Britain. It's one huge complex or combine, and it creates what's known not as the American power structure or the French power structure, but an international power structure. This international power structure is used to suppress the masses of dark-skinned people all over the world and exploit them of their natural resources. So that the era in which you and I have been living during the past 10 years most specifically has witnessed the upsurge on the part of the black man in Africa against the power structure. So, again, a lot of you questioned why I had us read the Communist Manifesto in preparation for Dr. King and Malcolm X. And here it is, right here, right? Malcolm X is making a Marxist argument. He's saying that Africans, in the view of colonial powers like the United States and Great Britain, that Africans and African Americans are just used as a resource, right? Not just the people, but also the land as well. Super fascinating, super interesting, right? How he says here, he says, this international power structure is used to suppress the masses of dark-skinned people all over the world and exploit them of their natural resources so that this is really interesting, right? Like he's saying, hey, America, France, Portugal, all these different colonial powers, they just want to use Africans. And then he's saying here that Africans in Africa are starting to push against that power structure, which is really interesting. And there were lots of different pieces of evidence for this. Um, And you have to realize too, this was kind of not during the height of the Cold War, but communism is still going on. And the Soviet power structure is still there, right? And so if you don't want to be a part of the Western power structure of England and France, then who you going to turn to for help? And like, it's just kind of interesting how Malcolm X is kind of touching these Marxist ideas. I would say he's doing it intrinsically. I don't think he's doing it purposefully, but still, it's really interesting. And he says here he wants his freedom now. Mind you, the power structure is international and its domestic base is in London and Paris and Washington, D.C. and so forth. The outside or external phase of the revolution, which is manifest in the attitude and action of the Africans today, is troublesome enough. The revolution on the outside of the house or the outside of the structure is troublesome enough. But now the powers that be are beginning to see that this struggle on the outside of the black man is infecting the black man who is on the inside. I hope you understand that what I'm trying to say. The newly awakened people all over the world pose a problem for what is known as Western interest, which is imperialism, colonialism, racism, and all these other negative isms or voluntaristic isms. Just as the external forces pose a grave threat, they can now see that the internal forces pose even a greater threat. But the internal forces pose an even greater threat only when they have properly analyzed the situation and know what the stakes are really. The stakes really are. So it's kind of complicated what he's saying, but he's saying okay, you have Africans in Africa rejecting colonialism. He's saying imperialism. You could probably use those words. That's fine. He's saying Africans are pushing against that. And then you have African Americans inside the United States or inside Britain pushing against it as well, right? He's saying that's a problem for these Western institutions. It's a problem for the United States. So, for example, he's saying, hey, the United States has a problem. They can't push against Africans and they can't use African Americans. African Americans are rising up. Africans are rising up. I wish there was more evidence of this as far as like something he could cite or say. But this is just a speech. It's not just a speech, but it's a speech. He doesn't really have to provide evidence. He's trying to persuade people what he's trying to say, but it's kind of fascinating. And he says in the next paragraph, just advocating a coalition of Africans, Afro-Americans, Arabs, and Asians who live within the structure automatically has upset France, which is supposed to be one of the most liberal countries on earth, and made them expose their hand. England is the same way, and I don't have to tell you about this country that we are living in now. When you count the number of dark-skinned people in the Western Hemisphere, you can see that there are probably over 100 million. When you consider Brazil has 2/3 what we call colored or non-white, and Venezuela, Honduras, and other Central American countries, Cuba and Jamaica, the United States, and even Canada, when you total all these people up, you have probably over 100 million. And this 100 million on the inside of the power structure today is what is causing a great deal of concern for the power structure itself. He's trying to be very persuasive. He's saying African Americans and Africans have more power than they think, right? He's looking at numbers here. And if Malcolm X and others could successfully make all dark people in the world think that their plights are connected, then he would be right. There would be an amazing power shift in the world. Which is interesting because Marx did not think that race existed. Remember, race is a social construction, right? Race was created in order to keep people subjugated. And Marx said that the idea of race is helpful for the bourgeoisie because it helps the bourgeoisie keep these people under control. Malcolm X is sort of leaning into the idea that that's true, but he's also not looking past race. He's still kind of very much racial as far as dark-skinned people should care about themselves, not poor people. It's actually really interesting. Dr. King's made an evolution past, I would say, some racist ideas. Not racist ideas, but he's looked past the plight of the colored man and looking more towards the poor man. He does this about 1967, 68. Malcolm X isn't making that transition, right? He's still black, 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 black. And again, it's interesting how he's thinking that. Okay, let's keep moving. Next page here. It says here, I'm on page 162. He says here, before I get involved in anything nowadays, I have to straighten out my own position. And this is really interesting. I want to read this paragraph. I want to discuss it. I have to straighten out my own position, which is clear. I am not a racist in any form whatsoever. I don't believe in any form of racism. I don't believe in any form of discrimination or segregation. I believe in Islam. I am a Muslim, and there is nothing wrong with being a Muslim. Nothing wrong with the religion of Islam. It just teaches us to believe in Allah as the God. Those of you who are Christians probably believe in the same God because I think you believe in God who created the universe. That's the one we believe in. And the one who created the universe, the only difference being you call him God and we call him Allah. The Jews call him Jehovah. If you could understand Hebrew, you would probably call him Jehovah too. If you could understand Arabic, you would probably call him Allah. But since the white man, your friend, took your language away from you during slavery, the only language you know is his language. You know your friend's language. So when he's putting the rope around your neck, you call for God, and he calls for God, and you wonder why the one you call on never answers. So he says, I don't believe in any form of racism, right? So let's talk for a minute. What does he mean by that? Is he trying to say that he doesn't think that whites should discriminate against blacks, or does he think that we're all in this together? Because I don't buy that. When you read this, I really want you to question if he actually says clearly, I don't believe in racism in any form. I don't believe in any form of racism. I don't believe in any kind of discrimination. And he says I don't believe in segregation, which is a little different than what he said during the Battle of the Bullet. So some of his views could be morphing and changing here. But you go read some more stuff in a little bit when we're reading this, where you will question if he really doesn't believe in racism. And so he says here, Elijah Muhammad had taught us that the white man could not answer in Mecca or Arabia. When I got over there and went to Mecca and saw those people who were blonde and blue-eyed and pale skin and all those things, I said, well, I watched them closely. And I noticed that though they were white, and they would call themselves white, there was a difference between them and the white ones over here. And that basic difference was this. In Asia and in the Arab world or in Africa where the Muslims are, if you find one who says he's white, all he's doing is using an adjective to describe something that is incidental about him. One of his incidental characteristics. There is nothing else to it. He's just white. So he's going to make a really nuanced argument here. And this is the argument a lot of people tend to kind of latch onto when you talk about Malcolm X making any kind of moderate transitions. He's saying here that white people in other countries, in the Middle East, in Asia, they say, I'm white as, hey, this is the color of my skin. But let's see what he says moving forward. He says here, but when you get the white man over here in America and he says he's white, he means something else. You can listen to the sound of his voice. When he says he's white, he means he's boss. That's right. That's what white means in this language. You know the expression free, white, and 21? He made it up. He's letting you know that white means free, boss. He's up there so that when he says he's white, he has a little different sound in his voice. I know you know what I'm talking about. So I think now we have a language to kind of discuss this. We talk about the term privilege, right? And the idea that in some power situations, some people have privileges. So it's easy to say that in our patriarchal society, men have more privilege than women. And that's actually 100% true, right? Men overall have an enormous amount of privileges as far as their ability to transition and move through this world safely. Versus women who constantly have to feel like they might be under attack. Women have to pay much more money for health services than men. All kinds of different stuff. And so what Malcolm X is saying is how in other countries, a white person's like, I'm white, but it's just a skin color. I'm just trying to tell you what my physical trait is. But in America, when someone says they're white, they have a privilege. So Malcolm X is saying some very interesting sociological examinations of our society, but he does it in a way that's plain and simple. He has the education and the knowledge to know this stuff, but it's almost like if you gave all the intelligence of a 90-year-old to a 12-year-old, right? The 12-year-old would be able to say and think things in a very sophisticated way, but it wouldn't come out that way. And so again, Malcolm X has a very intuitive connection to the problems of our country, but it comes out from his experiences. It's not coming out from a more academic sense. Dr. King would say things in a more academic way, and Malcolm X isn't, which is actually really fascinating. Malcolm X's speeches kind of flow all around, but when he does touch on something, it's very powerful. And what he's saying is that in a way that's not very sophisticated. He doesn't go deeper into it, but what he's saying is race in the United States is different than race in other countries, which I would say is absolutely true. Let's read down here. Okay, it says here, despite the fact that I saw that Islam was a religion of brotherhood, I also had to face reality. And when I got back into the America society, I'm not in a society that practices brotherhood. I'm in a society that might preach it on Sunday, but they don't practice it on any day. America is a society where there is no brotherhood. This society is controlled primarily by the racists and segregationists who are in Washington, D.C. in positions of power. And from Washington, D.C., they exercise the same forms of brutal oppression against dark-skinned people in South and North Vietnam, or in the Congo, or in Cuba, or any other place on this earth where they are trying to exploit and oppress. That is a society whose government doesn't hesitate to inflict the most brutal form of punishment and oppression upon dark-skinned people all over the world. Very, very, very powerful language here. He's doing the same thing that King's starting to do, which is he's talking against the Vietnam War, right? And he's also saying that the United States attacks or oppresses dark-skinned people all over the globe. So both men, Dr. King and Malcolm X, are starting to become more universal as far as their critiques. They're becoming more sophisticated as far as the problems that exist as far as the oppression. And from Malcolm X's perspective, it is the United States' government power structure's fault. Right? He has no problem saying that. Which is interesting because if you're Malcolm X, you're not going to think we need to pass legislation, right? Like he doesn't buy into that. It's also kind of fascinating going back to Marx as well. Marx argued that political structures and infrastructures and police and stuff like that are only owned by the bourgeoisie to protect bourgeoisie property. And Malcolm X has an intuitive feel about this. I doubt that Malcolm X probably read Marx at some point, maybe. But it's just so fascinating how he's making some really interesting Marxist arguments here in a very sophisticated way. Like you really have to understand Marx, and if you to see it in Malcolm X's speeches. Let's keep going. He says here, look right now what's going on in and around Saigon and Hanoi and the Congo elsewhere. They are violent when their interests are at stake. But for all that violence they display at the international level, when you and I want just a little bit of freedom, we're supposed to be nonviolent. So he's critiquing Dr. King here. They're violent in Korea. They're violent in Germany. They're violent in the South Pacific. They're violent in Cuba, and they're violent wherever they go. But when it comes time for you and me to protect ourselves against lynchings, they tell us to be nonviolent. So, again, I mean, okay, Martin Luther King was using nonviolent direct action as a rhetorical tool. Malcolm X is saying blah on that, right? And it's really fascinating because African Americans are being lynched, right, throughout the society, and even in the 1960s and 70s and 80s and 90s. African Americans were being lynched continuously, right? And the government wasn't doing a whole bunch. And if you're Malcolm X, you probably either A, know someone who was lynched, or B, understand lynching in an intuitive way. And he's saying that African Americans should protect themselves from lynchings, right? And so what Malcolm X would like to see is that African Americans would arm themselves. So if, let's say, a lynch mob would come to a black person's house, then the black people have guns to fight them off. But it's not but. It's just a weird place to be, right? It's like, in order for African Americans to keep the moral high ground, you can't use violence to protect yourself. You almost have to be able to take that sacrifice. Be like, okay, violence will be inflicted upon me. So I can say to people, hey, I'm not violent. I didn't do anything wrong. Yet, violence is being inflicted upon me. So it's just... It's okay to be conflicted, right? It's okay to think, I wish black people could use violence to protect themselves, and also understand why they can't. And it's almost to a point where it's a nightmare, right? Really think about what African Americans were facing in the 1960s, right? Dr. King probably wished African Americans could arm themselves and protect themselves. And I'm sure there's been instances where African Americans did, but there were so few. The percentage of African Americans to white people is so small, and the entire power structure of the United States was against African Americans. So it's like, what are you gonna do, right? It's just tough. But from Malcolm X's perspective, he says we should arm ourselves. We should protect ourselves. He says here, that's a shame because we get tricked into being nonviolent. And when someone stands up and talks like I just did, they say, why he's advocating violence. Isn't that what they say? Every time you pick up your newspaper, you see where one of these things has written into it that I am advocating violence. I have never advocated violence. I have only said that black people who are the victims of organized violence perpetrated upon us by the Klan, the Citizens Councils, and many other forums should defend themselves. And when I say we should defend ourselves against the violence of others, they use their press skillfully to make the world think that I am calling for violence, period. I wouldn't call on anybody to be violent without a cause, but I think the black man in this country, above and beyond people all over the world, will be more justified when he stands up and starts to protect himself, no matter how much necks he has to break and heads he has to crack. So, I mean, is he advocating violence? He says no. He says I'm advocating self-defense. No matter how many necks he has to crack and heads he has to crack, necks he has to break. And I mean, okay, I'm not going to excuse this, but first, I mean, remember his house was bombed, so he's probably a little upset. And also, too, is like, if I'm not going to hit you, but if you hit me, I'm going to break your neck, right? It's just like, I don't know. I wish that Malcolm X had a better grasp of what Dr. King was trying to do with nonviolent direct action. I'm pretty sure he did have a grasp on it. He just disagreed with it, which is, again, interesting. He talks about the Ku Klux Klan here, which I thought was interesting here. He says here, the Klan is a cowardly outfit. They have perfected the art of making Negroes be afraid. As long as Negroes are afraid, the Klan is safe, but the Klan itself is cowardly. One of them never come after one of you. They all come together. They're scared of you, and when you sit there, when they're putting the rope around your neck saying, forgive them, Lord, they know not what they do. As long as they've been doing it, they're experts at it. They know what they're doing. No, since the federal government has shown that it isn't going to do anything about it, but talk, there is a duty. It is your and my duty as men, as human beings. And he says men there, not as a general term, as actual gender men. It is our duty to our people to organize ourselves and let the government know that if they don't stop the Klan, we'll stop it ourselves. Then you'll see the government start doing something about it, but don't ever think that they're going to do it just on some kind of morality basis. No. So I don't believe in violence. That's why I want to stop it. And you can't stop it with love, not love of those things down there. No. So we only mean vigorous action and self-defense, and that vigorous action we feel we're justified in initiating by any means necessary. So he has some strong things about, again, violence. Take this speech, put it together with a ballot bullet, and you have a pretty good sense of how Malcolm X feels about violence. And he talks more about this here. He says here, that's all. And when we say this, the press calls us racist in reverse. Don't struggle except within the ground rules that the people you're struggling against have laid down. Why this is insane, but it shows how they can do it. With skillful manipulating of the press, they're able to make the victim look like the criminal, and the criminal look like the victim, which is actually really fascinating. It's a critique that you can even apply to the United States now. Like he says here, right now in New York, we have a couple of cases where the police grabbed a brother and beat him unmercifully and charged him with assaulting them. They use the press to make it look like he's a criminal and they are the victims. This is how they do it. And if you study how they do it here, then you'll know how they do it over there. It's the same game going all the time. And if you and I don't awaken and see what the man is doing to us, then it will be too late. They may have the gas ovens built before you realize they're already hot. So he used a little Holocaust imagery there, which is powerful. He's also critiquing the media here as well. Let's keep going. He says more stuff here. I want to go to page 166. He says, and then any Negro in the community can be stopped in the street. Put your hands up and they pat you down. Might be a doctor, a lawyer, a preacher, some other kind of Uncle Tom, but despite your professional standing, you'll find that you're the same victim as the man who's in the alley. Just because you're black and you live in a black community which has been projected as a community of criminals, and once the public accepts this image, it also paves the way for police state type activity in the Negro community. And they can use any kind of brutal methods to suppress blacks against their criminals anyway. And what has given us this image? The press, again, by letting the people, the power structure or the racist element in the power structure, use them in that way. So he's really going after the press and how the press looks at African Americans in the speech, which I found really interesting. Complaining about press is classic, but also it's difficult. I do think that the press should be held accountable for their actions, but also when you start complaining how the press is treating people, you've kind of lost the argument a little bit. So I wish this argument was a little more nuanced. Like, instead of saying how the press did things, I wish Malcolm X would tell the press how they should do things better, right? He is definitely critiquing the press, but he needs the press. He wants the press. He wants people to report on what he's doing. So again, it's a little bit problematic. All right, so let's keep reading here. He says here, a very good example was the riots that took place during the summer. I was in Africa and I read about them over there. If you notice, they referred to the rioters as vandals, hoodlums, thieves, and they skillfully took the burden off the society for its failure to correct those negative conditions in the black community. They took the burden completely off the society and put it right on the community by using the press to make it appear that the looting and all of this was proof that the whole act was nothing but vandals and robbers and thieves who weren't really interested in anything other than that which was negative. And I hear many dumb, brainwashed Negroes who parrot the same old party line that the man handed down in his paper. So it's actually kind of interesting. This is going to be a kind of a side note. I hesitate to do this, but I'm going to anyway. If you've been following COVID-19 coverage, then you might understand or might have heard that African Americans are dealing with the fatalities higher than most groups. And there's a lot of different reasons why there's a lot of fatalities in the African American community because of COVID-19. First of all, most African Americans, or the majority of African Americans, are in poverty, or more African Americans percentage-wise are in poverty than any other group. African Americans have less access to health care, stuff like that. So you put all that together, right? And the idea that if an African American goes to the hospital, they might not get the same treatment for a lot of different reasons. And there's been some suggestions that African Americans need to change their behavior, like stop doing drugs, stop smoking, right? Stop drinking so much. And no one, and there was an article about this with someone, I think the Surgeon General made mention of that, how African Americans need to change behavior, but no one was saying that other groups need to stop drinking so much and doing drugs. And so it's sort of like the idea for African Americans is like, it's on you to be better. You need to change your activity. You need to stop being vandals and hoodlums and thieves. You need to start treating your community better. But it's almost like either African American is doing really, really good, or he is doing really, really bad. But what everybody in the middle, right? And so, from Malcolm X's perspective, the idea from his perspective is that the press needs to spend more time talking about why the riots were taking place and why African Americans were rioting in the first place, right? And what kind of situations and conditions were created to make African Americans want to riot. So again, it's an interesting perspective about how he's looking at that. And it's stuff that's still going on now. I mean, it's not like because this was decades ago that our situation, our society has changed. Decades aren't that long, right? And there's still so many different aspects of our society that Malcolm X saw that it still affects us today. So if you look on the next page over here, he says, when the thing is finally sparked, the white man is not there. He's gone. The merchant is not there. The landlord is not there. The one they consider to be enemy is there. So they knock at his property. This is what makes them knock down the store windows and set fire to things and things of that sort. It's not that they're thieves, but the newspapers are trying to project the image to public that this is being done by thieves and thieves alone. And they ignore the fact that it is not thievery alone. It is a corrupt, vicious, hypocritical system that has castrated the black man, real strong language there. And the only way the black man can get back at it is to strike it in the only way he knows how, which again is the violence, which is kind of fascinating. All right, let's keep going. All right. He says here. All right, let's read this part here. Now, what effect does the struggle over Africa have on us? Why would the black man in America concern himself since he's been away from the African continent for 300 or 400 years? Why should we concern ourselves? What impact does what happens to them have upon us? And number one, you have to realize that up until 1959, Africa was dominated by the colonial powers. Having complete control over Africa, the colonial powers of Europe projected the image of Africa negatively. They always project Africa in a negative light. Jungle savages, cannibals, nothing civilized. Why then naturally it was so negative that it was negative to you and me, and you and I began to hate it. We don't want anybody telling us anything about Africa, much less calling us Africans. And hating Africa and hating the Africans, we ended up hating ourselves without even realizing it. Because you can't hate the roots of a tree and not hate the tree. You can't hate your origin and not end up hating yourself. You can't hate Africa and not hate yourself. So again, he's going back, he looked back, and he's trying to get African Americans to understand that the plight of Africans and African Americans are the same. It's unified. He makes some interesting discussions here. He says here on this page, he says here, you know yourself that we have been a people who hated our African characteristics. We hated our heads. We hated the shape of our nose. We hated one of those long we wanted one of those long dog-like noses, which is, again, it's not good what Malcolm X is saying here, but he says we hated the color of our skin, hated the blood of Africa that was in our veins, and hating our features and our skin and our blood, why we had to end up hating ourselves, and we hate ourselves. Our color became to us a chain. We felt that it was holding us back. Our color became to us like a prison, which we felt was keeping us confined and not letting us go this way or that way. We felt that all of these restrictions were based solely upon our color, and the psychological reaction to that would have been that as long as we felt imprisoned or chained or trapped by black skin, black features, and black blood, that skin and those features and that blood holding us back automatically had to become hateful to us, and it became hateful to us. Super fascinating. This is a really interesting discussion about the psychological effects of race and the idea that African Americans are psychologically damaged because of racism, which is, there's so many different studies that back this up, right? Just anecdotally, African Americans have used chemicals to lighten their skin. They've used chemicals to make their hair different than it naturally is, right? There's so many different ideas here, like the idea that African Americans will change the way they speak, change their language, change how they speak, how they present themselves, all that stuff. And Malcolm X, in just one paragraph, is able to articulate that and understand that and provide that in a really easy, elegant way. And so many different levels to that. Like he says here, it made us feel inferior, it made us feel inadequate, it made us feel helpless. And when we fell victims to this feeling of inadequacy or inferiority or helplessness, we would turn to somebody else to show us the way. We didn't have confidence in another man, black man, to show us the way, or black people to show us the way. In those days, we didn't. We didn't think a black man could do anything except play some horns, make some sound and make you happy with some songs and in that way. But in serious things, where our food, clothing, shelter, and education were concerned, we turned to the man. We never thought in terms of bringing these things into existence for ourselves. We never thought in terms of doing things for ourselves because we felt helpless. What made us feel helpless was our hatred for ourselves, and our hatred for ourselves stemmed from our hatred for things African. Really powerful. This whole section here is really interesting. He's pretty much explaining why African Americans have the issues that they have in 2 paragraphs. You might disagree with that, which is fine. But Malcolm X is saying the reason why African Americans feel inferior is because they don't understand their connections to Africa, which is, again, fascinating. Really, really fascinating. Let's see. There's a couple of places I want to highlight. Let's see. Let's look here. when the ball was passed to the United States, it was passed. He's talking about proverbial ball of power. It was passed at the time when John Kennedy came in power. He picked it up and helped to run it. He was the one of the shrewdest backfield runners that history has ever recorded. He surrounded himself with intellectuals, highly educated, learned, and well-informed people. And their analysis told him that the government America was confronted with a new problem, and this new problem stemmed from the fact that Africans were now awakened, that they were enlightened, that they were fearless, they would fight. This meant that the Western powers couldn't stay there by force, since their own economy, the European economy and the American economy, was based upon their continued influence over the African continent. They had to find some means of staying there, so they used the friendly approach. So he's talking about how the Western powers have tried to keep power in Africa and try to keep their influence in Africa. He's making some interesting political points. I would like more research on that before I really would say this is 100% true. It's a lot. I think Malcolm X is overstating some of the influential power of Africa in the 50s and 60s. But I mean, then again, that's fine. All right, we're almost up. There's a couple. There's a couple of places I want to highlight. The main thing I want to show you guys is he talks about his connection to Elijah Muhammad right here at the very beginning. He said, "I might say this before I sit down. If you recall, when I left the Black Muslim movement, I stated clearly that it wasn't my intention to even continue to be aware that they existed. I was going to spend my time working in the non-Muslim community. But they were fearful if they didn't do something that perhaps many of those who were in the Black Muslim mosque would leave it and follow a different direction. So they had to start doing a takeoff on me. Plus, they had to try and silence me because of what they know, because of what they know that I know. I think they should know me well enough to know that they certainly can't frighten me. But when it does come to light, excuse me for keeping coughing like that, but I got some of that smoke last night. There are some things involving the Black Muslim movement which, when they come to light, will shock you. The thing that you have to understand about those of us in the Black Muslim movement was that all of us believed 100% in the divinity of Elijah Muhammad. We believed in him. We actually believed that God, in Detroit by the way, that God had taught him and all of that. I always believed that he believed it himself. And I was shocked when I found out that he himself didn't believe it. And when that shock reached me, then I began to look everywhere else, and try to get a better understanding of the things that confront all of us so that we can get together in some kind of way to offset them. So here he's talking about his relationship with Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. What happened between him and the Nation of Islam is unfortunate. And I always think about how Malcolm X would have been different if he was not had such a crazy childhood, and if he had the education of Dr. King, or just even a regular education and had a normal life, how he would have been influential in the civil rights movement. Malcolm X inherently Malcolm X is kind of a lonely guy. He's out there on his own. He doesn't have the infrastructure to really do what he needs to do. The very organization that he cared about rejects him. He just seems like he's just kind of out there by himself, and it's kind of sad. It's really sad when I think about Malcolm X, because he died so young, and unnecessarily. He didn't. Nobody needs to die in any form, but especially with Malcolm X's case, it just feels like he could have lived such a stronger life. He had so many different ideas that were powerful for our society, and he was able to convey those ideas. Malcolm X's words are, people are always going to read him, and so I think it's important to understand that. But it's just sad he didn't have the same kind of family as Dr. King did. He didn't have the same kind of connections like that. He was out there trying to do his own thing as best he could. But he was very charismatic, and reading his speeches definitely outlined his genius. He understood the plight of the African American in such a different way. And the only way you can understand the plight of African Americans during the civil rights movement is to read as much of this stuff as possible. Not just King Malcolm X, but anybody. Read as much as you can, understand it from every angle possible because it's complicated. And it still affects us today. I mean, none of these, we've got legislation, we've got social changes, but a lot of this stuff still affects us, right? And the only way it's going to get better is if we understand it from as many different angles as possible. All right. Anyway, that is Malcolm X's after the bombing speech. This is the last one, last speech. Um, we'll be talking about different things as far as assignments and stuff later. If you have any questions, of course, you can email me. But that is it.